Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Cognitive Bias podcast. Today, I'm really happy to welcome my friend Geoff Futch. He has an academic background in physiology and biomechanics and is also, I believe, a judo brown belt, right?
Yes.
Welcome, Geoff.
Good to be here, Alex. And it's good to see you again and have another delightful, lively conversation.
All right. Something that I wanted to get into, just because it is, by way of the name of this podcast, and I love the way that you tend to formulate answers, Geoff. So I sort of want your take on this as it relates to cognitive biases.
Mm-hmm.
How do you tend to identify them or challenge cognitive biases that you see in yourself or in others? And what are some of your favorite ones to look at?
All right. Well, this is actually an interesting topic too, because just earlier this week, I was working with a group of my students teaching this kind of stuff. It's a really fun thing to go into. I guess I could start actually there's a laundry list that I could just go through and try to identify. And I sometimes do that as an academic exercise out there in the public, out there in the world. But there are a couple that I constantly see that I think are good to focus on. The low-hanging fruit one, the first one is, we have confirmation bias, which everybody and their sister knows about at this point, probably. This general desire that we have to be right and to maintain that sense of rightness, even at the expense of what's truly true, I guess you can say. And another one that's really common is survivorship bias, because of the way that people tend to self-select into groups. And so sometimes when you see a whole bunch of examples of a thing, your available evidence is a sort of skewed data set. And so you see a lot of that when people are talking about, all the Jiu Jitsu guys I see do this, or all the successful athletes in this field look like that. And well, if you look at it with a wider lens, you often realize that people or subjects or situations pass through these sort of selective filters.
Yeah.
And if you're not aware of those filters, you're not necessarily going to be aware of what you're missing, and that there could be other questions you can be asking and other little data points that can be very insightful, very enlightening, that you're just not going to catch because you didn't look early enough and you just saw this end result of the quote survivors of the group.
That's great.
Yeah, and
especially in martial arts. I mean, we do see that pretty commonly.
Oh, for sure. And martial arts by its very nature, I think, is one of these things that has a lot of self-selection. People will gravitate towards the arts that feel best for them or that they enjoy the most. The people who make it to higher ranks in a particular art form or high degrees of success tend to be the ones who are able to conform to whatever that program's norms are, or the biases, or the sort of cultural traits, if you will, that are in that field. Or that are in that group. You go to a certain school, it has a certain culture, and if you don't like it, you go to a different one. And the people who tend to thrive there are the ones who are going to stick around the longest. So those are the ones who are going to get high ranks and who are going to be teaching the others and then perpetuating the culture. And so recognizing the way that martial arts tends to serve in this sort of self-filtering or self-selecting way, I think can definitely give us insights on how we look at athletes and how we evaluate them in martial arts and how we maybe reach different groups of people that we're not reaching. It's really good to be aware of that. And I think you mentioned, what are some tactics or some kind of methods that one can employ or that I like to employ or whatever in dealing with these biases? Well, there are a couple of things. Two big ones. Number one, I think, is to go into the discussion and ask yourself a series of questions. So before you start going into a discussion or an investigation, say you're trying to learn about something new or learn more about something you already know some about.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what am I here for? What am I trying to do? Am I trying to win an argument or be a victor in some case? Am I trying to stay right about something? Am I truly open to being wrong? There's a series sort of questions that I encourage people to ask themselves so that you can at least be honest with yourself about whether or not you are in something for, I don't want to say the right reasons, but for perhaps more objective reasons or reasons that better serve truly learning about something. And at the very least, you may be able to go, oh, no, I am kind of biased. I don't really want to be wrong about this, or I do kind of have I have a horse in this race. And then you can kind of go from there and you can decide, well, if it's an argument with a person or a discussion you're having, do you want to continue that discussion? Maybe you don't. Or if you're going down a rabbit hole of looking for facts and you find that you're kind of letting that confirmation bias, for example, steer you. If you can at least recognize it, then maybe you're in a position to bring on board somebody who's more of an expert. Maybe consult with somebody else or get somebody else's perspective on it. Or just take some time away from it.
Well, while you're on this train of thought, you know, and mentioning willingness to be wrong. What about the fact that you already mentioned confirmation bias? What about the fact that we utilize something like social media so much, something that inherently helps create this bubble of confirmation bias? We're all building this echo chamber. We cultivate a following, be it the people that we spend the most time with or people with similar interests, what have you, where we end up, you know, surrounding ourselves with yes men. And even the algorithms for social media will feed you more things that you already engage with. So by design of social media and the people that we choose to associate with it, we're really pushing ourselves into a realm of confirmation bias, whether we're aware of it or not. So how does that play into this very process that you're talking about?
Well, I think a first approach is doing what you just did. You spoke to it. You speak to the problem, you identify it, and surround yourself hopefully with other people who also can see the problem and don't shut up about it. And, you know, at least if you keep the problem in the forefront of your mind, it's a little less likely to sneak up on you. And so if you're able to identify that, and then you can kind of make some decisions about, well, can I cultivate a group on social media? Can I actually still engage with this tool, but do it in a way that's maybe a little bit more in service to welcoming other perspectives and not just confirming what we already believe? It can be hard. I've seen groups that do it though, and that seem to pull it off pretty well. You occasionally will see debate groups and groups for scientific discussion that don't go off the rails. There probably are more disastrous ones than not, but I think they do exist. Alternatively, you can just, some people take the extreme approach. Maybe, I don't know if you think this is that extreme or not, but some people just get off of social media entirely and they start to cultivate these relationships and foster these discussions in a different setting. So doing it face to face or doing it, you know, over the phone, one-on-one, because at the very least, then if you're engaging with people and it's not just through text, you can maybe appreciate the humanity of the other person if it's about debates and arguments and disagreements. That doesn't necessarily get past the whole confirmation bias side of, well, I'm going to look things up on the internet. I'm not on social media, but I'm going to look up some stuff and try to learn about it. And I still start kind of going.
I mean, Google and its algorithms are even going to confirm that bias a bit themselves, right? So, I mean, what I seem to be as a common theme is awareness, right? Being aware of them as best you can and trying to identify them.
Yeah, that's a big part. And this is a very difficult thing to, I'm still working on it. I think I always will be. You want to surround yourself, and this kind of relates to the other general tactic of facing biases I was going to go into. It's you surround yourself not necessarily with experts per se, but people like sharp people who are willing to call you out on stuff and whom you're willing to call out on stuff as well. And not necessarily in an angry, aggressive, confrontational way, but just to remind each other, like, hey, we can keep each other in check. And
more candor.
Yeah, you know, and obviously there has to be a degree of understanding between the individuals involved. Like Alex, you and I think, have enough of an appreciation for the same kinds of things that if I say, hey man, I think this is a little off and here's why, or you do the same to me, the initial reaction is not going to be one of super defensiveness. It's not going to be one of like, all right, you know, let's go in the yard and fight about it. It's going to be, especially you'd mess me up right now anyway. But no, even not right now, always. But yeah, it's
get out of here.
It's just being able to have a degree of understanding and mutual appreciation for what it, you know, how important it is that we try to stay objective. And sometimes that may mean keeping somebody in the room who kind of annoys you. It may mean, you know, there's somebody who's kind of on the fringes of whatever it is we're discussing, but we keep them around because maybe that person keeps us honest.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize that, like, say you're in a room full of quote unquote evidence-based people, and you all tend to share certain views on certain subjects, and you got one person who seems kind of out there to the rest of the group. Is it harmful to keep that person around? No, not usually. I mean, if that person is genuinely, to use an overused word, genuinely toxic or genuinely harmful in some meaningful way to the group or to what you're trying to do, then of course you have to do what you have to do. But if it's just about differences of opinions and that person can be respectful as well, that person can be an asset. But it's up to you as an individual and it's up to your group to determine that, to make the decision about whether or not, you can keep a person around in good faith and engage in good faith with them, even if they don't agree with whatever.
And keep it constructive.
Yeah, absolutely. We've lost some of that, I think, owing to just the very easy and insidious nature of creating these social media bubbles, these echo chambers where it's just, it creeps up on you because of the way the algorithms work and the way we kind of start to filter our groups we interact with, what we start seeing.
Unfriendly if you don't agree type messages.
Yeah. I try not to do that. There are times when, if you don't agree that like slavery is a bad thing, or if you don't agree that whatever, like something that's very obviously not good, or is very good. Like if you can't align on certain things that are fundamentally moral in nature, that's one thing.
For sure. And it brings it back to that constructive statement, right?
Absolutely.
There are people who could disagree with you in a constructive manner, and there's some things that are just so far off base that it's not even worth entertaining, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Absolutely.
All right, cool. So I love the discussion on cognitive biases, and I have a feeling that we'll circle back to that at some point. But let's talk about you for a second. What initially led to your interest in physiology, biomechanics, exercise science, that sort of thing?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think this is kind of a multi-parter.
Okay.
Initially, it was a very kind of basic, superficial, childlike thing. As a kid, I watched a lot of action movies, and I saw these buff guys on screen that I wanted to look like. I was raised on a lot of 80s action films, some earlier than that too, but definitely the Stallone, Schwarzenegger kind of era. Jean-Claude Van Damme is a huge guy for me. I'm a big fan of his too, and so I saw all this stuff, and I was like, I want to look like that, and I want to be able to do the things that they're doing and be this kind of, my very simplistic childish understanding anyway of like this, this manly man persona. I want to be able to do that. I want to be strong and big, and I don't want kids to pick on me, blah blah blah, all that. And that general interest persisted for a while. And by the time I got to high school, I finally started working out somewhat regularly and embracing that a little bit more and exploring my own physicality. But when I went to college, I didn't study it initially. I was in a different field, went into physics, and then I went into pre-law for a couple of years. But while I was in college, I started doing martial arts, and I started noticing the differences that my training was able to make, even though I was doing all kinds of stupid stuff, reading just random magazines and hearing gym bros talk about whatever. And I didn't have any systematic way of getting better at it so much, but just by trial and error and dumb luck, I started noticing some benefits there. It fascinated me. And somewhere along the way, after a couple of years into my pre-law degree, I realized, I'm spending more time at the gym and reading about exercise and reading about the human body than I am studying like my case precedent material and all this other stuff. Not to bag on law. I actually do love that field. But at the time, I just wasn't in the headspace for that. And so I said, well, why don't I switch my degree? So I did. Went through after a few years and finished my undergrad in kinesiology. And then the next phase started. Basically, so this is like the third part, whatever. A little while, maybe a year after I had finished my degree and I was kind of figuring out what to do. I worked as a personal trainer and was doing some martial arts instruction.
What year was this? Just so I could have a frame of reference.
This would be, I finished my undergrad in 2011. So like in 2012, so I was a year out from getting my exercise science bachelor's. I was approached by a friend to do a group study kind of thing, run study groups for an exercise physiology class, the same one I took when I was still doing my undergrad. So a year and a half before. And the long and short of that is that I kind of went in with trepidation, didn't really know. I knew I kind of had a reputation of being a decent explainer of stuff from my time as a personal trainer, which I was still doing, but the club I used to work at, I ended up being one who would like teach and explain stuff to the other trainers sometimes. So I was like, I guess I can take a crack at this. Well, it ended up being a huge success. And what started as like 3 or 4 people grew to like study groups of 20 plus, prepping for like the final at the end of the semester. And I got the bug. I fell in love with teaching, and specifically teaching in that realm of stuff that I'd been an okay student of when I was doing it during my undergrad. But now I realized I was developing a different relationship with it. And so I said, all right, that seals it. Let's find a way to get off to grad school and keep this train going. And through a series of weird events, I managed to do that. Went off, did my master's in exercise science, and was continuing to love to lead study groups, and I was looking forward to being able to teach. And I started tutoring a lot at that point. So in 2013 is when I started my master's, and then that just kind of continued when I moved to Austin to do my PhD, and it was the same kind of situation. I was tutoring, and then I became a TA and was doing it there, and then I became an adjunct professor for a little while at a local college, and doing biomechanics and physiology. And it was just this kind of, it just gained momentum where I would learn more about a thing, then I would be really eager to teach it, and I'd get an opportunity to teach it. So then I learned more, and it just sustained itself. And then people I taught would say, hey, you're kind of good at this, you should keep going. And that's really where it's been ever since. So I gravitate towards learning about and teaching exercise science principles, as well as some other things. And in particular, I gravitate towards, hey, you know what, we thought this, but it's really kind of more like this. Pointing out these little inconsistencies and things that I used to miss and other people miss, and homing in on these little, those little variables people don't pay attention to, those little quirks and nuances that just show how much deeper and how much richer this stuff can be.
Man, that's great. I love it. So you mentioned pretty early on in that stage, you started to pick up with martial arts as well. Explain that particular part of the journey, and if it ever sort of blended with the journey that you just mentioned.
All right. Well, I started martial arts my second semester of college, so that would be January 2006. So yeah, it's going to be. Was it 2006? Yes. So it's been a while. So we're coming up on 15 years, and my first class was a Taekwondo class. I kind of flipped a coin. It was either that or judo. My first one was Taekwondo because I liked, the fancy kicks and all that stuff. It was very visually dazzling to me.
And you also said you were a fan of Van Damme, so it's
absolutely. I was going to say that if you didn't. Yeah, I loved it. I want to do it, and I was actually kind of flexible, for an average computer geek dude that never really was an athlete growing up. I took to the kicks and the stretches and some of the athleticism a little more readily than I expected to, and I really loved it. Kept doing that for a few years. So that was my first martial art, and I actually continued doing it on and off, mostly on up until very recently, in fact. And now I don't have a formal place where I train, but I'll still find a bag and kick it and do old forms that I used to do. And I've mixed it since then with kickboxing that I've picked up along the way, and some other traditional boxing, karate, and Muay Thai, and various things that I've had less formal training in. But that was my first art. And actually my first exposure to martial arts was like this traditional martial arts thing. Mm-hmm. But after a few years of that, so in 2009, got my black belt in Taekwondo, and I started doing judo as well. So I started doing them concurrently. And same teacher taught both, which was kind of unusual. But yeah, I went into that thinking I was athletic, thinking I was like, oh man, I'm a martial artist. I'm a black belt. I got this. I'm good. Totally wrong skill set though, and wrong kind of athleticism to do judo, where instead of being bouncy and like super light on your feet and all that, they would just catch me on a bounce and flip me on my back. And I spent my first summer doing nothing but practicing falling, either voluntarily or otherwise. And it humbled me really quickly, but I loved it. As bruising as it was, as much as it was a different kind of stress, I really embraced it, and I started competing in judo.
And not to hijack that, I mean, practicing a ton of break falls, you don't really see the value in that until all of a sudden you find yourself losing your balance and you use it outside of a martial arts class.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, my old teacher has a habit of riding around town on his bicycle, sometimes in places that aren't the safest. And I think at one point he was hit, well, like a car cut him off or something. Like his bike collided into like the front of the car, and flipped over the front, but he just did a front roll, like rolled to his feet on the pavement, like had a couple scrapes, but he like rolled right to his feet and said, oh, I guess it's good that I did that stuff for 30 years or whatever.
Man.
Yeah. And I mean, he's had his share of spills and a lot of cool stories. And I've had a few myself where like I got knocked off of something or I slipped or whatever and was able to just kind of roll out of it. And it's absolutely, people laugh when I tell them this, when they ask about self-defense. I'm like, dude, seriously, My number one principle for self-defense is just don't even be there. Just don't get into bad situations. But barring that, I think my next most effective thing I've ever learned was just how to fall really well and then also get back to my feet very quickly.
It's crazy. It's one of the least sexy things to learn, but it's so useful. Man, I grew up in New England, and the amount of times that I slipped on ice and just had to break fall, man, it's hard to even quantify what that even saved me from, because
Sure.
a fall on ice and pavement can go south pretty quick.
Yeah. So imagine that. You want to talk about healthy aging, right? Imagine having a person who, had never been in a fight in their entire life, but they developed a base, they developed a skill set there, and they get a little older. Maybe their balance is not quite as good as it would otherwise be, but they remember a break fall, and that saves them from, having a really disastrous impact,
Yeah.
when they fall at home or whatever. It's just, it's a super, useful skill set. I'd say easy in the sense that the task itself is not super, super complicated, but you just got to do about, 6 or 8 million repetitions of it.
Well, it's crazy how strong the impulse is to foosh, to stick a hand out when you're falling, which, especially when there's a good amount of momentum or, kinetic energy there, that can get really dicey.
And as martial artists, right? Raise your hand if you know at least a couple of guys who stuck their hand out during a fall and broken something.
Yeah.
Whether it's a carpal bone fracture or a radius fracture or whatever it is,
even an AC separation.
Yeah. Speaking of, shoulder separations, I've had 3 of those, all 3 from judo. So, go figure. I'm fine now, but yeah, they were cranky for a little while. So like that fall that's a big one for sure.
So what does it look like, in recent years, in terms of your training? Have you expanded beyond those arts? I know we talk Jiu Jitsu sometimes. Paint that picture a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of formal training, I've done a little bit of time training with Shotokan guys, which is a pretty easy jump from Taekwondo because there are a lot of Taekwondo programs that actually overlap and have like Shotokan katas that they use and things like that. But outside of that, I've trained I've done a lot of informal training with friends who did other stuff, like friends who did Muay Thai, where we'd hold the pads and bag for each other and kind of trade notes. Like, oh, well, I learned to chamber this way. It's like, well, I learned to kind of swing from the floor this way or whatever it was. Super, super cool. And actually some of that influenced how I started changing, even though I was still formally doing Taekwondo classes, I started changing how I would kick or how I punch and how I block things. Just incorporating elements of other arts and principles that I thought worked better. And so there was a little bit of that. I've done different subdisciplines of Taekwondo and karate, but beyond that, you mentioned Jiu Jitsu. That's my most recent thing, where last April, I started doing Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. I had Jiu Jitsu practitioners come to my judo club, and they would teach us a few things over there, and I would roll with them, definitely get a different feel just because of that. But we were often still doing newaza by judo rules. And so it wasn't quite the same as just getting immersed in a jiu-jitsu environment. So I formally started doing that last year, and I have a blast every single time I go. I'm out for a while now because of my recent surgery, but I'm hoping to eventually get back into that. And I love being able to mix the two of them. And I'd like, once I'm physically in a position to do so, and of course, the lockdowns and everything like that, these things sort of are, these start letting up and everything is safer and whatnot. I'd like to continue exploring more, whether it's doing an MMA class formally or MMA training, not a class necessarily, but MMA training in a formal kind of setting, or doing Muay Thai, more kickboxing type stuff or whatever.
Well, you certainly have the martial arts to mix for mixed martial arts,
Yes.
and I've found having trained MMA myself, having that to fall back on makes that way easier. Now, I did want to jump on something that you had just sort of started to get towards before we come back to talking about COVID as it relates to martial arts, because I think that's a pretty interesting subject as well.
Sure.
But in the realm of sports, I think that many martial arts or formal competitions within those arts, be it even one of the more popularized ones like MMA, seem to be behind other sports in many different contexts. And if you want to keep it within your academic lens, we can keep it there. From a sports
Yeah.
science perspective, what steps do you think martial arts or MMA or whichever specific one you want to talk about can take to catch up to these other sports? And part of it, at least from what I've observed, is a lot of these different biases, some that you had mentioned previously, or even appeals to authority, people who are really successful within a martial art, thinking that that expertise
When I was going to,
over into other areas, and people following that and sort of giving them more of a voice and more of that echo chamber. Well, what sort of thing, are there any sort of red flags that you see in the sports science realm within martial arts?
Yeah. Well, I kind of want to separate them into two groups too, because you have your traditional martial arts, the more formal, you want to say old school, these singular martial arts that tend not to necessarily be a very lucrative venture from a competitive standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they can be very lucrative, like running a school and you get lots of classes that you teach, especially with kids. They tend to be very, if they're run well, it's a great industry there. I'm not saying that to bag on them. It's just is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
That is one thing. And then you have the more openly competitive sports, MMA in general being this huge cash cow it's become, and to a lesser extent perhaps, but it seems like there are people who are trying to build it up. Competitive Brazilian Jiu Jitsu now, you're seeing more tournaments coming around. There are people getting sponsorships. There are people who are, who are making their life kind of center around competitive Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and they're living okay, some of them, and that's not a thing you see with people who do karate. Typically, it's not a thing you see with taekwondo. It's not a thing you see even much with judo, despite the fact that judo and taekwondo too, they are Olympic sports.
Right.
So there's some, and this will take me to another point I'm going to make. There's some attention they get as traditional martial arts, but it's because they're Olympic sports that they get the research attention. But at least if there's money, you will see some places in the MMA world where somebody might want to pay for a little bit of research or sponsor a study. They at least talk about it. You hear about this more. But you're right in that in general, that doesn't, or I think you hinted at this earlier, there's a general behindness. I'm going to use that as a word. There is a general state of being a little bit lagging. And I think the reasons are a little different though. So there's just no money in it. And thus it's very hard to get funding for most of the traditional martial arts that you'll see. So if you're a researcher who's trying to get a grant, or if you're trying to push for this, people are going to ask, well, who cares? At least if you have something that's a sport that's generating a lot of money in some way, shape, or form. So it doesn't have to be martial arts or combat sports. It could be, football or whatever. Somebody is more likely to be willing to fund that. So I think the industry interest and money thing is a little less of an explainer for MMA. But it's still fairly new. So there probably is some of that. And also, I think MMA is hard to define. How do you categorize an MMA athlete? If you're trying to match subjects in the study, what is the set of characteristics that would define them? And I think, you ask 10 different people who've done MMA, and they might give you, if not 10, at least 5 different answers. And so there's probably some of that. But barring all of that, sort of the practicality stuff, you mentioned biases and fallacies earlier. There are these huge things. In traditional martial arts, you're, I think, probably always going to have this big elephant in the room of appeal to tradition and appeal to authority. My teacher taught me this way, and so it must be the right way because they're my teacher, and it's this kind of circular logic. Or you'll get, well, it's always been done this way. Tradition, in particular, in those martial arts is a bigger deal. Not as much, I think, in the MMA world, which is a little bit more out in the open, and it's a little bit more, hey, let's test this and see what works. People, I think, as a part of that culture might be a little bit more willing to, like, hey, let's throw hands and see who comes out on top, or let's test this in the fire. Let's pressure test this thing. Sometimes in an obnoxious way, sometimes in a friendly way, but there's that desire a little bit more to go, no, people actually do this in the ring against each other and the world watches. So let's see what works.
Do you think that the role of sparring in a lot of these more applied arts is sort of that immediate testing? Like, hey, teaching a technique, and then I'm going to attempt it in a live round 10 minutes later. I mean, you get that validation or lack thereof immediately. And then that prompts that question. You can go back to your instructor and you can go, well, I tried this the way you said and it didn't work. Look, and they go, well, look, you didn't have this grip right. That's why it didn't work. And it really helps like reinforce the technique or the thought process behind it because it's being tested immediately.
Yes, with a caveat.
Okay.
The caveat is this. There is, in the realm of traditional martial arts and other martial arts as well, but I've seen it a lot in the traditional, kind of strip mall martial arts school. You have to be careful about whether the culture is there to reinforce the techniques as they are, or it's there to continually improve. Those things tend to be in conflict with each other. So you will have people who have sparring, but the sparring is never really that intense. And if something doesn't work in sparring, it's just kind of hand waved.
Gotcha.
So if the culture in that particular school, club, academy, environment, whatever, is such that they do that, then it can actually be very harmful because now you have people who have an additional layer to that false sense of security. Not only do I have a black belt from this school that maybe didn't teach me much that was useful, but it also, well, I've tested it even. I've sparred, so I know that I can handle this in a fight. So it does depend on the intensity of the testing and the mindset that everybody in the room has when they're doing it. Like, are we being open and honest? Like, is the teacher being very clear? Look, just because you can do this does not mean you'll be able to handle this other scenario necessarily. Or just because you do this thing in this controlled environment with these rules doesn't mean that you're going to know what to do or that you're not going to panic if somebody comes at you in an alley with a pipe. And so with that understanding, yes, I think sparring can be a great thing. And it's kept in its realm. It's kept in its space. And I think even a lot of mixed martial artists will tell you, like, champion level, elite level MMA fighters would probably say, well, sparring is still not the same as a street fight. It's right. Ones who've been in street fights. Now, it doesn't mean that all things being equal, if you can handle yourself in the ring, you're probably more likely to be able to handle yourself in the street. I would say that's a pretty safe thing to say. Probably true. But they're still not the same. So it's just, we have to be aware of that.
For sure. No, I think that's a great answer. Now, you mentioned the intensity. I didn't have this down as a question, but this sparks one that I do have. I think with some of these younger, and let's just look at the more applied arts for right now. Okay. And I like to view this because myself, I've been around both of these individual sports, so I can see that there's a bit of a difference. But if we look at something like MMA versus Jiu Jitsu, and I'm talking about competitors, people who have made this their lifestyle, talk about intensity of training. A very positive change that I've seen in the MMA community, as long as I've been around it, is that, out of necessity, we're starting to see this idea that, like, okay, more and harder isn't always better, right? We've got to be able to hit the gas when it's appropriate to hit the gas. And sometimes we've got to pump the brakes. And I work with some high level MMA athletes, and man, they'll spar heavy once, maybe twice a week in fight camp, right? And then that's not to say that they're not doing other forms of sparring. They're just not doing heavy, full contact MMA sparring the whole time. They're getting high intensity training in, but it's in very controlled environments. And coaches are wisening up to the fact that they've got times to really pour it on and times to pull back a bit. What I think is sometimes problematic in jiu-jitsu is that these injuries and people slowing down and getting their bell rung doesn't really happen in jiu-jitsu. So sometimes you can get away with this more harder type thing. What do you think is the answer in terms of these rapidly developing, rapidly growing arts? How do we find that line? And if we look at something far, that's gone through this stage 50, 60 years ago, like football, American football, you see that these guys know they're not doing full contact practice every single day. But some of those skill position players will be with their guys, whether, watching tape, doing drills, etc. How do we get something like jiu-jitsu or even MMA, which is a little further along, how do we get them to refine that process more?
Oh, put me on the spot with that one. Let's see. Well, I think a big part of it, as usual, is, starting off by having the conversation, keeping the conversation going. The more people who talk about this and point to those examples, look, these other arts or these other sports, got wise to this fact. And also pointing to, and this kind of touches on the previous question, the research issue. Research does show in some of these other areas, you get people knocked around over and over and over. It's showing that that's not necessarily a good thing. Whether you want to talk about CTE, among particularly like football players and similar athletes. I think there's been some research on boxing specifically where, you can see trends with people who do like hard sparring all the time versus ones who don't spar very often. They do lots of pad work and lots of other drills, and they watch their footage and they do all this other stuff, and they do spar periodically, but they're not accumulating all that sparring mileage. And a lot of the even experienced boxers will say now, like, you don't need to do that every day. And how did I have a career that was this long instead of just this long? Well, one of the things I attribute it to is that I didn't get the crap kicked out of me every day. And I think you keep pointing to those examples and you keep promoting that discussion. And also, I think this is another thing that's going to help. The wider and wider scope for mixed martial arts that you see, because now you see it's not just these hardcore, mostly guys going in and doing it. And you're starting to see, not just starting, this has been starting for a while. You see mothers in there. You see entire families going and taking MMA together and also doing Jiu Jitsu together. You see accountants and teachers and engineers and, business people who drive around in fancy cars. You see the whole gamut of the human experience, the whole breadth of society.
Nerds like us.
Yeah, exactly. Gigantic dweebs, getting on the mats. But you see people getting in there from all these different different walks of life and different backgrounds, who all have different paces, either by virtue of the demographic group they come from, or just because they're an individual and they have their own injury history, they have their own priorities, they have all this stuff. And so now you're seeing more and more schools, academies, clubs, etc., who are having to accommodate that fact. And they're having to speak to groups of people where on the left side of the room, I might have, Jim Bob over here who's going to every single tournament all the time and just refuses to quit and, is here every day and I'm tired of seeing him. And then I might have, the family man over here who, comes in once a week, maybe twice a week, and has an old back injury and is not looking to be a cowboy. And, I got to speak to both of these people. Mm-hmm. And so being able to accommodate, hey, you can modulate your intensity and your frequency based on what you can handle, and having that be an accepted message, having that not be something that gets shouted down, because we're starting to see more and more examples that it is okay to do that. Mm-hmm. I think that's just going to have to persist, as people see from a business perspective that it makes sense not to break the people who are training at your school, and also to seem more inviting and seem like you allow people to kind of throttle things based on where they're comfortable. Just enough examples of that will tend to rub off, I think. And I think it's just a question of time. So in boxing, it's, I think, evolved to a certain point. MMA, I think, is getting to that point somewhat. You mentioned BJJ is a little bit behind, maybe chronologically. And I think just as things get exposure, they tend to go through these phases. Will it help if more research is done? Probably. And so, like, if I had all the money in the world and I could fund research on combat athletes or in combat sports with formal combat athletes and not, I'd probably do it and say, okay, well, now we can have some, we can have some more objective knowledge and information on this. I do think, though, that in general, it's just going to be this gradual cultural shift where people start to realize, oh, I don't have to prove, how tough I am. And we actually see objectively that, like you said, working harder is not always better. Working more is not always best. Then there's a balance to it. That's my thought, at least.
No, for sure. I think this is great. And I think that this discussion, and also, I mean, you mentioned research a few times.
Yeah.
This data does need to be collected. If we look at other developed sports, we look at something like baseball, they keep a pitch count because they know that if a pitcher is throwing a ball with that type of power production, force production, and is doing that with, exceeds a certain amount of volume within a certain amount of time, they will probably start falling apart, so viewing their pitchers as assets, they won't let them exceed that volume because it's no longer beneficial. And I think the same could be said for any of these martial arts.
Oh, absolutely. Uncomfortable comparisons to animals notwithstanding, like you get people who race horses and they'll say, don't over race your horse.
Right.
It's anything, any person, any asset that you have. You drive your car too hard without proper maintenance, which takes time and resources. You're sooner or later something's going to go sideways. And you would think it's common sense, but common sense is a kind of a nebulous thing in the realm of combat sports, and especially when we're in the moment, right? When you're in it, you're having a great time, and you just want to keep going, keep smashing it. Absolutely. And sometimes it takes a little bit of restraint to kind of pull yourself back and go, oh, no, I need to strategically kind of, wind it down a little bit, hit the brakes, because I got to think about the long game. Absolutely, to your point. It's just one of those things, like pitch counts, great thing. I would love in my judo club if we started doing throw counts.
I mean, how many times can your head withstand being rattled off the mat? And I know that we learn to fall to minimize the impact on the brain, but man, on a day where you've been thrown a high number of times, I mean, I've certainly felt this. You start to get like this brain fog type feeling, because
you're shaken up. Yeah, and it's and even if like you don't get the brain fog thing, your body can still only handle so much mileage. And it's very telling about how hard a throw can be. To make a little point for judo that I like to remind people of, like, you think that it's just a throw. Okay. I'm a very good faller. I will brag on myself on this. I'm very good at taking a hit and taking a fall because I've done it so many times and I've taught other people how to do it. I may not be very good at throwing people, but I'm good at getting thrown. Okay. And, but after I've taken a few sets, like 3 or 4 sets in a row, say like 10 or 12, at that point I start feeling it. Like, okay. And that's into a crash pad on top of a tatami, which is then on top of the floor, which could be even a floating floor, like layers with some give. So now imagine taking a hard hit when you don't know how to take a fall from an experienced thrower, not onto a mat, but on the pavement, And so it's one of those things where you're still subtly reminded, this is really hard. Some of my friends and I like to say, and I forget where I initially got this, but judo is the subtle or the gentle art of, judo means the gentle art of the gentle way, as does Jiu Jitsu. Roughly translates to a similar thing, right? The gentle art of hitting someone with a planet.
Okay,
you basically, okay, I'm bringing you to the ground or I'm bringing the ground up to you. Either way, there's an impact happening. And to your point, like, you can only take so much of that. And it's sometimes people overdo it. And, here's another thing that I think I see. If you're evaluating people by inappropriate metrics, for example, if you're comparing adults to children, kids bounce around differently from adults in many cases. Like, if you get a whole bunch of 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds, the forces they're exposed to are different. In some positions, you don't ever want to put them in versus an adult. For example, joint locks and things like that. You may want to be careful in some cases. Definitely careful in terms of how you're coaching them. Good Lord. But the way they hit a mat might be different because their center of mass is literally not falling for as long.
Well, and with that, I think that us utilizing available data, which may not exist yet,
right,
but I think it's important, even when we talk about durability between adults, the person teaching the class may happen to be an outlier. They may recover faster. They may be able to handle a little bit more volume. But then expecting your students to be able to do the same thing can be problematic and really detrimental to their well-being.
That's a fantastic point. That actually resonates with me beyond just martial arts, just more in general, but in martial arts and any kind of sport and in academic circles. You as a teacher have an obligation to your students, and part of that obligation is not to project onto them or to assume that they can or should do things the way you do. Yes, there are certain cases. If I'm teaching math, then obviously there are certain right ways and certain very wrong ways to do certain problems. And so, like, there are limits to this. But yeah, I should not expect the same capacities or the same aptitudes, same thresholds just automatically because a person walks into my dojo or walks into my school or whatever, and they want to learn certain things. They may take longer and they may not be able to take the beating that I can take, or maybe they can take more of a beating, And so that is a big point of caution for people. It's like, make sure if you're a freak that you know that you are, right, that you're an outlier, so you don't try to bend other people to that same expectation.
Right. And that's the mark of a good teacher, right? They're going to meet you where you're at. They should challenge you. Absolutely. Right. But they should have that within a context of understanding that people are going to be different. And I mean, whether it's in academia, whether it's in martial arts, I mean, we can probably think of very influential people that have done that very well or not so well. And there are, there are very positive or negative effects that go along with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, just feeding that line out though at an appropriate pace. It's a tricky thing. It's a skill set in itself.
So to build off that, this is something that I've observed. Again, I'm going to go to other sports for a second, but COVID has done a very interesting thing with two sports in particular, and as it relates to injuries.
Yeah.
The basketball season, I credit Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, with really helping with awareness with COVID, because as soon as they canceled those initial NBA games and then the NBA season, everyone was like, oh, damn, we got to take this seriously. If they're really leaving money on the table like that, this must be a big concern, right? And yeah. I think they did a great job with that. Now, when they came back what they did is they had 8 regular season games. Their season was still very much shorter than it would have been. But they came back with 8 regular season games and then jumped right into the playoffs, and they had a bubble. And when I saw this, with basketball being a hardcore sport that can be very tough on the joints, I saw that and initially had the hypothesis. I was like, man, this is a recipe for disaster. These guys are going to go in there. Some of those teams that they had in the bubble needed those 8 games to even make it to the playoffs. So they instantly came back and were playing at 100% effort. And I was like, this can't be good. Yeah, they did a couple scrimmages when they first got to the bubble. Not only was that not the case, I'm a fan of basketball. Incredible gameplay throughout the entirety of the bubble. They were strict with the bubble. They had 0 cases within all of the players that they had in there. They did a fantastic job. And even if you just juxtapose this year's playoffs with last year's we had all these catastrophic injuries because, like any other year, it goes all the way through the regular season, brief all-star break, continues out the regular season, then right into the playoffs. And at that long stretch, people even will call the NBA playoffs the second season, and they line them up back to back. And these guys, due to overuse, last year, just in the finals, the 7-game series in the finals, you had Klay Thompson tearing his ACL and you had Kevin Durant blowing out his Achilles. Neither of which even played at all this year due to the injuries they sustained in the finals last year. This year, of course, there were some injuries, but there was nothing catastrophic. And it blew my mind. And it really, talking to a friend of mine who has a PhD in a related field, he was talking about, and this really woke me up. He's like, they were in a bubble. There was no travel, and how travel affects their recovery. We're really starting to see that. Now, real quick, I do want to let you talk about this as well. But now when we look at the NFL this year, the NFL had very limited training camps throughout the summer. Even once training camps started, because they had no bubble system, they limited contact in practices. They skipped the 4 games of the preseason, where normally you've got your starters playing a quarter or not even an entire quarter, and then you've got a bunch of young guys trying to prove themselves and get and get some play time for the rest of the game. And
want to get senpai to notice them.
Well, exactly. and it ramps them up appropriately for the first regular season game, which each game is very important in football. And this year, skipped the majority of training camp, very little contact even amongst the team as they were practicing. Then they went right into the first really, really important regular season game, and injuries from week 1 this year have been through the roof. Catastrophic injuries, soft tissue injuries like I've never seen this number of guys thrown on injured reserve due to hamstring injuries. And it was just wild to me how, in basketball, I kind of expected that. Wasn't the case. And if you look at it, there were other factors at play, right? So we can sort of look back at that. But yeah, it sort of wakes you up to the fact that, so much of these developed sports are in this fine balance. And sometimes due to different deals that they have, they'll play them too many games in a season, and they do that for the sake of revenue. But even so, you tilt that slightly and you can see drastic changes in a positive or negative manner. And I would like to see, obviously not due to a pandemic like COVID, but I would like to see how people could propose changes within these martial arts and how people spar and allow them to have longer careers by examining similar data. I mean, What is your stance on, what you're seeing a lot in professional sports, like load management, versus the classic old school Mamba mentality of just, going hard until you run yourself into the ground? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And how can we bring that to sports that are seemingly behind in the research world?
Well, I think you hit a lot of really important points and explained them really well with that. The trends are kind of in front of us. We see, and we've seen examples prior to this, that as a general rule, whatever the status quo is for exciting competitive sport, whatever, if you back off on just how much you are loading these people or how much you're beating on them, they tend to do a little better, maybe more than a little better. If it's like kind of just on the wrong side of that tipping point, and you take off just you could be 10% of the mileage before they go into a season even. And that might make the difference between whether they're a little bit hurt in that first game, which makes or breaks it, makes a difference between whether or not they are actually properly injured, overtly injured in some more catastrophic way during that effort, and so on and so forth. So these things can definitely blow up on you. You see this kind of compounding of the injuries where, if you catch it early enough, you make a slight adjustment here, it can have massive ripple effects down the line. We've seen this in a number of different sports. Yeah, I mean, you talked about a great example where a different kind of situation has brought this to the fore. I think that in general, I hope anyway, I don't know that I think for sure, but I hope that sports everywhere are watching this. I have noticed, maybe you have too, with people in martial arts, and it's a running gag. People in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu think that they have the market cornered on this, but I think all my judo friends are the same way, where they're like, I'm not hurting every day now. Like if they had to take time off, they finally took time off for the first time, could be in years. For the first time in years, they had like an actual full week of nothing.
Well, there's sports without an off season, right?
Right. And people forget that. Like, yeah, professional athletes who also have access to some of the best doctors and some of the best, therapy and sometimes some of the best pharmaceutical aids, depending on the sport and depending on what exactly you're talking about. Even then, and the fact that these are people often who are physical specimens, genetically, they're in the tails of the distribution. Even after all that, they still have off seasons and they still get hurt. So why would you think that you would not get hurt? If you continue to beat up on yourself, unless, you're throttling your intensity and your volume pretty well, pretty smartly and really listening to yourself. I hope that people are watching this. And I do think that at least some of the clubs, like people at my judo club, have made a lot of comments about this, about how I never really took this much time off before, but I'm feeling really good. Like I know I'm going to be out of shape when I come back, but I feel healthy, like physically, as far as my joints and my injuries and all this stuff. And I hope that that message rests. Now, how do we address it beyond that? Depending, we can come back to that research thing and say, well, there are people who start to do research, even if it's just observational stuff, looking at injury rates, doing cross-sectional studies, comparing different groups, what have you. That some people might listen to that. I don't know yet whether or not at large, jiu-jitsu schools and MMA gyms and whatnot are going to really be that eager, or they're going to care that much about like what's getting published in an exercise science journal or something, until you see an example being set at the top. So, and actually that brings me to a point I was maybe going to make earlier. You see occasional, right? You see attempts at trying to take a more scientific approach. You will see some athletes who are doing this thing or that thing. Often it's more like one-off gimmicks, like, hey, I'm going to see this person for a whole bunch of cryotherapy. And now when I say gimmicks, I don't mean that there's zero evidence behind them, but just they're attempting one modality or one strategy, but they're not actually doing direct research on themselves and their peers necessarily. But you are seeing professional athletes at the highest levels in mixed martial arts, for example, in competition, who are starting to, at least on a superficial level, kind of embrace this idea that, hey, I can go to a lab and maybe get more data, and maybe I can use that to track my own progress, even if I'm just an N of one. That can maybe lead others to maybe start doing the same. And then if that same lab has had a number of people come through, maybe then they can start compiling stuff, and maybe it'll snowball from there. And if you see this kind of signal or this message coming from the top, maybe then your local MMA gym might be a little more inclined to start going, well, is there any research that's been published on that? Is there anybody here who can read that? Can we have a conversation about that? Or can we listen to this podcast that talks about it? Or whatever.
It's interesting you say that. So we went to the UFC Performance Institute about a year and a half ago for their combat sports clinic, and they gave out a handbook. Unfortunately, they didn't publish this because they didn't want to deal with all the headaches that go along with that. But they compiled their own data on all sorts of different things, average ranging from like average length of time of a bout at different weight classes. Different paths to victory at different weight classes, injury rates, what joints are most commonly injured, et cetera, et cetera. I've got an extra copy. I'm going to make sure that you get one. It's
great to see.
But the thing that's a shame is that because they didn't publish it or whatever else, it's not being distributed. It's not widely accessible. And I think that there needs to be that leap. And it's great that the UFC is investing resources in the Performance Institute and collecting that data.
I agree.
You got to make sure that it gets out there. Your average MMA gym should have access to that.
Oh, for sure. Especially, if you get, think about it, your average MMA gym, maybe not everyone, obviously, but you get a lot of them that are they're supporting the culture. They're supporting from the bottom, what do you get in MMA gyms? You probably get a lot of people who are, who pay to go to MMA events or who in other ways try to support what the UFC is doing. They serve as feeders, sometimes feeder gyms where, people at the local level start competing and then working their way up. And yeah, it's, if nothing else, just from kind of like a goodwill standpoint, a way of also giving back to that community, putting that information out there. It is interesting to see that often you get these private entities, even if they're massive ones, that often lead the way with, well, we think our bottom line can be improved if we get some data, if we do some research. So we'll do some in-house stuff and we'll just use it for ourselves. But sometimes if that's handled well, that leads to an explosion of broader, more public domain kind of stuff. And then you finally see a wave of research that gets done, kind of the dam breaks, and you see additional investigators who start looking into these sports, looking into these events or these populations they really haven't looked at before. Somebody often had to blaze the trail. I'm thinking, and it's not exactly the same case, but like Gatorade and how it came about, you dig back into the story of like the Florida Gators. So of course, this is the college team, basketball team. I think at halftime, like they weren't going to the bathroom. And so there was this question that arose of, oh, wait, well, what's their hydration looking like? They're just drinking water. And then it started provoking certain questions about,
that's a great example.
Yeah, about what was going on with their electrolyte levels and what can we do that's different. And so then, suddenly the Gators start doing a little bit better at their games because they're a little bit better hydrated or whatever. And well, what's going on? Well, there's these eggheads in I don't know what it was called at the time. There was a physiology department or the sports science department or whatever it was, started concocting these things that, just try to address carbohydrate and electrolyte levels as well as just raw hydration or raw water intake, and started noticing stuff, and fast forward however many decades, of course, Gatorade is this massive empire, was this massive product, but lots of times things get born out of that. And it's, there's a need that's identified by somebody who's either in industry or who's in that particular sport. And you just hope that, like you said, that it comes out, that they start to share that kind of stuff. And, I don't know if the UFC would be receptive to suggestions from people, whether it's people in the sport formally or people in the sports science world. They started imploring them, hey, people can be helped by this, put this out, let us use this information more publicly and let us continue to build on this. I don't know if they'd be receptive to it, but it's a signal that needs to be put out there, definitely.
For sure. No, I love that. And the Gatorade example is huge. I mean, that's the perfect example of how somebody within that private sector was able to pave the way.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Now, there was something that was mentioned a little back that I do want to circle back to. This is something that I know myself, I wrestle with. I think due to your injury, you haven't actively had to for yourself. But what are your thoughts? I mean, like we mentioned before we started recording, neither one of us are experts per se on COVID. But with with the closeness and the proximity that's required for martial arts, particularly grappling arts, what are your thoughts on training throughout COVID? And correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen massive amounts of cases or numbers being reported from martial arts or jiu-jitsu academies. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I don't think the data exists that can conclusively say why, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that? What's appropriate for training, and why are we not really seeing these spikes? Or if you are, illuminate me.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen the spikes either. I'm struggling to think of anybody at any of the schools I trained at who even directly knows anybody who's gotten it, which is a weird thing because, you know, in broad terms, you think about communicable diseases and you're like, well, yeah, if you're sitting there and as one of my training partners said, you know, you're sweating in somebody's eyeballs, like
Literally.
just, yeah, like you are literally drenching yourself in other people's sweat and you're breathing on each other and you're doing all this stuff. It's like, if you were going to transmit, you know, some kind of virus like this, like that's pretty much how you would do it. Like you can't think of a more ideal petri dish, right, to create. So indeed, why is there anything going on? Now I can just spitball here, because I don't know if we have any hard data on anything kind of tangentially related that can clue us in on this. At least I'm not immediately aware of it. It could be a combination of things, probably is. Like my local jiu-jitsu school was very good, tried to be as good as they could be about a few specific things, being very, very harsh about, like, if you have the slightest cough, get out of here and don't, you know, and go get yourself tested too, and insisting.
Which, by the way, tends to be the culture at most gyms anyways. They're not trying, even when it's not a pandemic, they're not trying to have even a cold run through their student body.
Who wants to be that guy, right? Who wants to be that guy that came in and spread something? And whether it's, you know, the guy with the weird staff thing on his foot, you know, things that make you go, yeah, but like, yeah, you don't want to be that guy. So I think there is that culture that was there in place to begin with and only got more strict, you know, as things progressed with the pandemic. In our particular case, putting out, you know, hand sanitizer everywhere. And for a long time, they've loosened up, I think, since then. And I'll get to why that might or might not be okay. But initially, they had even specific paths that you would walk through the gym. And they were aggressive with the ventilation. So at least, like, as people are breathing out, you have big box fans out that are blowing stuff outside to kind of disperse it. Because it's like, you know, if you're sharing the same kind of pocket of air with a person for prolonged periods of time, then that increases the likelihood because you're literally increasing exposure and potential viral load. If you're at least able to keep refreshing the air that's in there so it's not the same pocket of air there, maybe that is also contributing to a reduced incidence. I think there could be a great degree of self-selection happening. If you are good enough about your core group of practitioners and you don't have a lot of new people coming through the school, they're the same people who are always there. And you happen to lock down before any of them contracted anything and they are all distancing properly at home, it could simply be the case that they have been vigilant enough, and maybe they're a little different from the population at large. I don't know. But it could very well be that these people are using up a lot of their kind of adventurous, risk-taking behavior in the gym. And then once they go home, they kind of lock down. They're not doing a whole lot. I know there are exceptions for this. I know people I've done martial arts with who are kind of out partying and doing stuff. But I think in general, statistically, it may well be that there's also some behavioral thing there. It could also have to do with health. There have been studies that have come out lately that, generally speaking, being more physically active and practicing a decently healthy lifestyle in terms of diet and exercise probably is protective. I mean, it's protective for most diseases, and it seems like this one follows the trend. Not that it's a surefire thing. Obviously, we've seen examples of competitive athletes who've died from this, which is horrible. I mean, anybody who dies from this is, you know, it's a tragedy. But it does seem like statistically there's a reduced likelihood there. And so when you combine these things, the behavioral differences, the possible self-selection that you see of people who are kind of just keeping into that group and they're not mingling with other out groups, you know, and the fact that they're physically maybe healthier, all of these things, you probably have a combination of factors that might more than compensate for the increased proximity that people have during that, you know, 1 hour or 2 hours, or maybe it's a few hours a week or whatever that they're doing when they're training. Those are my suspicions. I would love to actually I'd love to talk to an epidemiologist about it. I'd love to talk to some virologists about it, because maybe I'm totally off base on this. But it would be really cool to get their opinions on, like, take a look at what these people are doing and why aren't we seeing more cases than we're seeing?
Right.
I would love to get their opinions on that.
I saw, man, if I could find the link again, I'll shoot it over to you later. I saw a while back an Australian opinion piece, right? Where they started off with, some basic science as to how, via droplets, COVID can transmit from one person to another. And then what they did is they took a couple different environments and said, this is what we think would lead to the most infections, right? And they laid them out. They laid out different work settings. They laid out fitness centers. They laid out martial arts centers, yoga studios, et cetera, a bunch of different ones, and sort of laid down their assumed risk at each type of location. And then what they did is, this was a couple months ago, but they'd had months worth of data. And then they compared it to what contact tracing had actually found. And it was nothing like what you would think would occur, just sort of like what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
Their hypothesis, and again, it's an opinion piece. They don't have anything to prove this, but theirs was very much a difference in culture. Oftentimes, in a work environment, you can sort of beat your chest and wear it like a badge of honor if, I don't take sick days ever, right? And if you've got a little bit of a fever, lots of young people can go through and have relatively mild symptoms and, it's not that bad, I can still go to work type thing, versus the culture that's established at fitness centers and martial arts studios where, like you said, you don't want to be that guy. That same type of thought doesn't exist for most work environments, right? It's not like, oh man, Mark, you were the guy that brought that to work. That's not it. It's, oh man, Mark, you never take sick days. You're great. You're reliable, right? And they kept bringing it back to those different expectations that exist within those settings. And I found that to be interesting because I'm not going to lie, when this first happened, and personally, my gym, we shut down, we halted all in-person training. I was really thinking, I'm like, man, based on what we're seeing in some of these places where, healthcare workers don't have PPE and the viral load that they're taking on, I'm like, man, jiu-jitsu, that's going to be ugly. And I kept watching and I stayed away from it for some time, and I'm like, why is this not happening? And now there, that's why I had to bring this up as a question to you. I love asking people who are smarter than me because I'm truly puzzled by it. I can't fully wrap my head around why there's so few cases.
Yeah, and I wish we had data to point to, because again, I think we're both kind of operating off of what we see from the culture. You're in martial arts for a while, you kind of get a sense of what martial arts practitioners tend to do and what the culture tends to be in at least the decent places, right? And yeah, it seems to be that's going to be at least part of the explanation, is that they are more likely to pay attention to if they feel sick, and they go, all right, I'm not gonna go do that to my boys, and there's that dedication there. Beyond that, I don't know. Oh, I thought of another thing too. Remember early on in the pandemic, people were talking about temperature and how like the summer was going to kill the virus.
Yep.
Well, I do wonder if to some extent, and I need to go back and look at the research on that, but if there were some truth and some veracity to the notion that being just generally, if it's hotter, transmission is reduced or the strength of the virus is reduced or whatever. Well, it does get pretty hot in those places.
Yeah.
That's a pretty flimsy one, but it did occur to me that in a realistic way, if you have a dramatic alteration in a person's body temperature, so if most of the time when they're in proximity to other people, they're also hotter, they're above their normal resting body temperature, they're sweating, does that have something to do with transmission one way or the other? I don't know that we have research on that, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
For sure. No, and I mean, lucky enough for you, by the time the knee is healed up enough, hopefully a lot of that stuff exists where we do have definitive answers. But let's say hypothetically, and this is, again, just opinion and, also due to your geographical location. But are classes being offered in your immediate area? And if you were healthy enough, in regards to your knee, would you engage in martial arts training, whether modified or not? And no judgment here. I'm just curious.
Yeah. There are some. I don't know the full landscape. I do know that my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school is open um, here in Austin. For you, just so people know, I'm in Austin, Texas. Uh, and Austin has had an interesting up and down with the virus itself because compared to other parts of Texas, they went through some differences in terms of how they try to triage people, and there was a sort of a progressive command center approach that they did as far as EMS to try to pipeline people to go, certain types of testing and getting them in if they actually seem to be symptomatic versus not and all that. But it's a different tangent. But point is, things have been confusing around here for a while. But my school opened back up, my jiu-jitsu school, back in, I think it was late April or early May. Like there was a shutdown for like a month and a half. And then it may have been a little later. It may have been late May. It couldn't have been later than May though, I don't think, based on what I remember, because I posted something about it. But anyway, and they started off with those very, very strict modifications, right? And like I was saying earlier, they relaxed some of it afterwards. But if you still only have the same people who are going in all the time, it's the same group. And if the virus has not infiltrated that group, then re-exposing those people to each other won't magically make the virus spontaneously, appear. Mm-hmm. So it's just other people those people interact with when they're outside of there that could be the contributor. My judo school isn't really open. I did some practice like one-on-one for like kind of video lessons for everybody else to follow along with at home. I was just with my my instructor, my judo instructor who runs the club. So we've done some stuff like that, but we haven't actually started up formal in-person classes with the group or anything. Now, if I were healthy enough to join, would I? I can see going back to doing the judo stuff I was doing. As far as jiu-jitsu, I want to wait, given that right now we're seeing spikes locally. I would wait till that is over because even if the school itself is still doing things well, my jiu-jitsu school, I don't know about how those people are going to interact with their families and everything else, given that we're going into the holiday season. I want to wait until that's done just because even if everything else is good, that itself is a big risk, or it's a big question mark anyway. It's a big unknown. And if we come out on the other side of that and things haven't exploded over at the gym, then I might, by that point go, oh, okay, I could probably walk on the mat and show up. Granted, my ability to roll is limited anyway. So if I were in there right now, of course, I would just be off to the side watching. I did drop in a few days after my surgery. Okay. Again, for anybody who cares, I had my ACL reconstructed about 9 or 10 weeks ago. So, yeah, fun times there. And, it just kind of popped in and said hi to him, watched for a few minutes, whatever. And then I wandered on out, but I wasn't ever on the mat, And, I just kind of want to wait and see as far as how that's going to go for now. Though I'm, like you said, the no judgment thing. Like I'm not jumping all over the other people who are there right now who are training because it looks like they've been very self-contained outside of that. Like we were saying, like they stick with their families and they leave their families to go and do jiu-jitsu and they go home. Mm-hmm. And so it's like it's still a self-contained group for the most part, and I'm hoping it continues to be that for a while.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely reassuring seeing how numbers haven't exploded within that community. And I also, there's all those different, jiu-jitsu like tabloid type pages that I follow just to see. And I'm sure they would jump on it if there was a mass outbreak at a school where plenty of people got sick. I'm sure it would be out there somewhere. And I just personally haven't seen it.
Yeah, and I'm with you in being surprised. I am, like, just my general gut feeling was like there are going to be some. It may not explode. It may not be the worst thing like you see with, sadly, like at some schools where there have been these things where a bunch of kids get it and like some of the teachers get it, that kind of thing. We've seen pockets as schools have reopened. Like I predicted that would happen too, but I expected something similar to where like there would be some pockets popping up in these martial arts schools and gyms, and I can't think of any recently. Yeah. Where it's happened. I'm sure it has. And I'm sure there have been cases whether they've been reported or not, but you're not hearing about it. Yeah. Like you're not on the level like you are with these other things. And that's very curious.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I got a couple more quick ones and then we'll wrap it up from here. Now, you mentioned before a passion for teaching. Yes. Do you ever see yourself formally instructing any sort of martial art, not just on the side as a hobby, but as your own business endeavor?
It's possible. I had a part-time thing where I was the lead instructor for a Taekwondo program back in my hometown for a little while, but then I moved away for grad school and like my life went in that direction. I don't know if I would ever do Taekwondo again at a formal kind of level for reasons I probably would take a long time to get into right now. But I'm very eager to get back into doing the training with that. As far as instruction goes, I probably see myself doing judo. If you were to put a gun to my head and say, okay, there were some particular thing that you would be an instructor for and have your own place, or be running your own program of some kind, I can see eventually maybe running a judo program. I certainly don't think it would be outlandish for me at least to end up being one of the assistant instructors for the program I'm in now. And I would just continue, just stay there and just be one of those people who's been around and is helping to run it.
Enjoy teaching without like the headache of.
Right. Yeah. But would I ever have my own? Possibly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm open to it.
Cool. And then the last one I'm going to ask you, who are some of your idols and influences? I know you mentioned some in martial arts. If you want to expand on that, go for it. You could also mention some more in the academic realm. Mentors could fit the bill. Go ahead.
Charles Bronson, man. Now, I've just heard people in interviews actually say like Charles Bronson was so awesome. He was a man's man. I actually was a big fan of his. But no, on a more serious note, first person, my dad. Because he was one of these people who, not intentionally, mind you, but he showed me a lot of aspects of humanity and like being goofy and still trying to get through life, even though you have certain struggles. And not just the romantic side of it, like you see in nice feel-good movies, but like the rough side of it too. I just learned a lot by watching him. And he encouraged me always to be a very curious person and to embrace my own kind of silliness. And like he raised me with a whole bunch of, I had my own set of encyclopedias in my bedroom. I had a whole library basically, as well in an adjacent room that I had access to.
I never would have guessed.
Yeah. Right. It's like, I can word good sometimes. But yeah, like I was raised around all of that and had a computer as soon as I could sit upright in a chair, I was able to, play around on computers and type and stuff. And so he encouraged and cultivated a lot of that in me. And a lot of my friends didn't have the same kind of opportunities in that respect. And I'm very thankful for that. And again, he just catered to that. And he also encouraged me to have a lot of integrity, which I'm still working on, always getting better with and keeping myself accountable. But he had a lot of that for differences that we had. That was a big thing with him. So he's one. Next up, well, there's my first martial arts teacher, and actually all of my martial arts teachers taught me a lot about work ethic, which is probably a standard thing that you hear. There's almost a sort of nobility in hard work that's focused on the right thing. And I've been able to extend that, not just to physical training and working out or working on a technique or something like that in martial arts, but also in academic work, in projects that I work on when I'm writing a paper or if I'm teaching. These are the sorts of things like you learn to pour yourself into a thing and try to master a craft. And that effort to become truly excellent at a thing, knowing that you're never going to be perfect, but really expecting a lot of yourself and continuously working on that's a big deal. Learning to respect that was huge for me. And so martial arts taught that to me. And another thing that came in particular from my first martial arts teacher, who was the one who taught me Taekwondo as well as first taught me judo. He used to say, take what you do seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. I really like that. And I parrot that all the time to people. And it even reflects in how I teach people. I can be a huge goofball and I'll make fun of myself, but at the same time, the material I'm actually teaching does matter. And I try to make sure people pay attention to the details. And some people think that that's contradictory. I don't think it is. I think that you're just embracing your whole nature by doing that. And you keep things more fun. And you don't get dragged down by the negatives quite as often because you're able to still laugh at stuff and enjoy the trivialities sometimes. So there's all that. And Another one who informs how I approach things academically is one of my favorite scientists ever. And I have so many, like I feel like I'm doing everybody else a disservice by only mentioning this one, but one I have to mention is Richard Feynman. Feynman, who was known as the great explainer, he was an amazing thinker, and he had a reputation for being able to explain things fantastically, and it was a justly deserved reputation because he really was amazing. But more amazing than that, to me, may have been the way he projected a sort of humility, at least to me. Others may disagree, but his way of constantly saying a thing in a way so as to kind of convey this, I think it's this, but I don't really know. Maybe I'm wrong. Like even when, he as like a particle physicist, one of the world's experts on how atoms behave would say, well, heat is jiggliness of atoms and they just kind of, shake each other around. And he would give this very simplistic explanation saying, yeah, it's basically that. At least that's what we think. He always had a way, from what I saw, of just being very self-effacing and very honest about how we have to be open to being wrong. And one of the most brilliant people who ever walked the earth, according to many people who knew him, but was humble enough still to do that. And it's one of the things that makes him, I think, endlessly watchable. If you watch any of his videos, if you look up stuff on YouTube of him giving lectures or being interviewed, it's fantastic, I think. But also makes him endlessly inspiring to me because that kind of humility combined with the curiosity that he had, it's hard to find, and I wish more people would emulate that.
Man, I think it's great that we're sort of bookending this. We started off talking about a willingness to be wrong, and that's where we circled back to at the end. I think that's great. Geoff, it was definitely my pleasure having you on here. We're going to have to do this again sometime.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Oh, anytime. I'm happy to be here. It's wonderful.
All right.